Hey folks, Blake here, and we're going to go into a little bit about Skyboxes. I was teaching my VR development course today, and we saw some strangeness with some Skyboxes, and I was really used to building Skyboxes myself in six-sided cubes, and one of my students had gotten into this interesting position where he had some other kind of Skybox, which I thought was interesting, but I've also had some additional confusion and whatnot about Skyboxes and how they work and what they do. So I was going to go into them a little bit. So here's a scene, and this has the default Unity Skybox. This is just a blank, brand new scene, right? Blue on top, brownish on the bottom. So this is the built-in Skybox that comes with Unity. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a 3D object. You know what? Why don't I use a sphere? Because spheres are really nice at helping you see what's going on in your scenario. And I'm going to make it a little bigger just so that we can, again, clearly see what all's going on with our rendering. All right, so that should be, you know what, I'm just going to get up even more so that we're able to very clearly see, yeah, what's going on in rendering. So here's the sphere. It's getting the lighting from this directional light, and I'm actually going to turn that guy off. Right, so now we have no lighting whatsoever. And all of a sudden it's black because there's no lighting whatsoever. And if we hit play in the game, you don't see any lighting whatsoever. However, that's not actually necessarily... here, turn it off. You know what? I'm just going to nuke it. Not necessarily the only source of light. So you have what's called an ambient light source. So you can go to Window and go down to Lighting. Right, I have it over here in a tab over next to my inspector, but it may pop up in a window. You can move it around wherever you need. And so the environment lighting is a Skybox, and it says the default Skybox, and that's the Skybox that we have, which is the blue and the brown. And whereas the sun in ambient source here is Skybox, which is interesting. So the Skybox is actually a source of light. So we can go ahead and hit the build button, and we'll take it a couple of seconds, depending on computer speed. And now all of a sudden we have some lighting going on. We can see that it's blue on top and it's brown on the bottom because the ambient area is actually providing light into the scene and coloring, coloring this sphere. Now, what's interesting about the Skybox is this is a material, right? And there is, when you go into materials, right, you can create a new material, and in that material, and we'll just call it test material, right? We're going to take a look at our test material here. Over into the inspector and the shader, you can go to Skybox, six-sided cube map procedural, right? So here's the default procedural Skybox that we're used to seeing, but then there's also like the six-sided, and that's what actually lots of people use for kind of a backdrop to the game. And then there's also this cube map. If you have an HDR image, you can create a cube map. I haven't worked with that too much, to be honest. But, so these are the different materials, but you can also just have the standard shader, and then here it is, you know, and we're going to make a very shiny and very smooth object, and you can see that I had previously had one. And so we have this shiny, smooth test material, and I'm going to grab that, I'm going to dump it on there just so that we can also see what's going on with the Skybox. So, the other place you'll see Skyboxes is with your camera. And you'll see here it has the clear flags, and so anywhere that the camera doesn't see a mesh, it has to render something, right? Well, it doesn't actually have to. You can turn it off with don't clear. But normally you put something behind it, right? When you're working with a HoloLens, you make that black because black translates to transparent on the HoloLens. And so in game mode, you would see this sphere floating here amongst a sea of whatever your room is instead of a sea of black. Or Skybox is the common one, and that uses, or should use, the Skybox from, the Skybox from the scene. I have seen cases where there have been some funkiness where it didn't appear. It appeared like the camera's skybox was different than the lighting skybox for some reason, and I'm not sure how that disconnect happened, but I feel like I've seen that happen before. So if anybody knows specifically what causes that disconnect, go ahead and leave a note. So with the skybox on, as soon as you hit this build button, it's going to recompute all of the global illumination, the ambient global illumination, the baked, has a lot of performance benefits at runtime, not so much at build time. And so a lot of people sometimes use the ambient GI. So let's talk about these skyboxes real quick. So here is a sample skybox material. We'll see it here in the inspector. So this is a 6-sided skybox. I have templates and stuff that I use to help me build a seamless skybox. So this is a beautiful skybox, and it's worked great. Now here's the thing where I can take this material. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. Oh, it worked this time. So I'm able to just click it and drag it into the scene, and then boom, it uses that skybox in the scene. If I go over to the lighting, there we go, we'll see this new skybox. And if I hit build, because this is still showing the old skybox, now it's showing a reflection of my skybox in this object. And so the shinier and smoother my material is, the better the quality of that reflection. And so now I have it perfectly smooth and completely metallic. And it looks great. And it renders that skybox effectively. Let's see here. And so that's with the 6-sided skybox material as opposed to the procedural, which I showed you earlier. There is, let me go ahead and rebuild that lighting, and it looks wonderful. Again, with the main camera, you can turn off the skybox if you need to. So go ahead, click on the main camera, turn it into solid color, and so you'll still get these reflections. So the lighting is still there and it will still show, but then again, this is a full black background, which is useful for things like Microsoft HoloLens or other augmented reality stuff that uses black as clear. Yeah, and I wish I knew how. I've seen that one project get the skybox kind of funky. Now, the other thing that I have seen that is something of a problem is I have this test material, right? And this skybox can take just about any material, but not necessarily effectively. So when you do select material, it's not just showing skybox materials, right? We have this test material. That's the material we created down here. That's not a skybox, right? But we can select it, and now everything goes black, and then we haven't rebuilt our map, and so we see a reflection here, even though the actual skybox is black. But when you rebuild, then that resolves the disconnect issue. Right, but then you can also have, pull in sprites default, and it doesn't support skybox rendering, but it still shows. Like the other one was black, and this one is white, and you may be able to create a material, right? And then we have this material, and I don't know what happens if you do this. So go in and pull one of my skybox materials. Oh, this is my new material. I'm going to lock that and go into my skybox, and let's discover what happens. And if I pull the front and I dump that in the albedo, right, now we can see this material. And now this is, instead of reflecting that light in the skybox, it's more like it's been printed on, so it's not shiny and it's not reflective. So you can do a couple of things, one of which, and it won't let me drag it in there, but it will let me drag it in here. which isn't right. It's not what you want, but it lets you do it. And so it looks pretty funky. And of course, everything is black right now because I have the lighting turned off, and this material doesn't support Skybox rendering, and so there's clearly an issue there. You can turn up the intensity, turn down the intensity, and it never works. So I have seen cases where there have been materials that aren't the right material that have ended up in that Skybox. So you want to make sure that you get a proper Skybox material like this one. And then when you can just drag that and drop that into the scene, and it'll tend to accept it. Well, let me rebuild the lighting because that helps. I'm trying to think if there's anything else about Skyboxes. So you can also turn the Skybox lighting off, right? You can just have a color. And so even though you may render, it's interesting. Even though you may be rendering the Skybox, it doesn't act as a light source, although I do feel like I'm getting one here. But it might just be... no, that's my unlock. There we go. Right. I create a material, and we just have the kind of the default material, toss it in there. There we go. Okay, it still shows. So it's still reflecting the Skybox, even though the Skybox isn't acting as an ambient source of light. But you can also put a gradient in here as an ambient source of light. But generally speaking, having the Skybox actually providing the lighting gives some very nice, very realistic effects in terms of lighting. Gives you much better quality. So that's it about Skyboxes. So the lighting Skybox and the camera Skybox, generally the same thing. They're linked. They're not always the same thing. I do, again, feel like I've seen a case where the camera Skybox, the Skybox that was rendering the camera was not the one being used in the lighting. Like they got disconnected somehow. I'm not quite sure how that happened. It might have just been a fluke in that one project. But I've also definitely seen cases where the lighting material Skybox, because they don't limit this to just materials that have the proper rendering type, the proper renderer, you can end up with some really inappropriate Skybox things, and people are going to be confused because they don't know where to find this Skybox information under the lighting because it's hidden away. It's not nearly as obvious as some of the other settings. And again, you bring in a new Skybox, right? And if you don't build, or if you don't have auto on, it will look very strange because you'll see the object and it will look like it is reflecting the wrong thing. And that will also happen in game. Like here I am, I'm running the game, and my sphere is reflecting the old Skybox. I am showing the new Skybox, and it doesn't sync up right. And that's just because I have to hit build. The other thing that I do feel like I have seen is that there was a material successfully brought in that wasn't a six-sided Skybox or a procedurally generated one. So I'm not sure if it was a cube map that somebody had created or if there was something else that was going on where they accidentally got the wrong thing in the Skybox, but it wasn't a traditional Skybox, and it wasn't rendering quite right. It was rendering fine in the editor, but when it got into the game, it wouldn't render quite right. So I'm still trying to figure out what exactly happened in a couple of these edge cases. But hopefully, just by playing around with it a little bit and building your own, you'll be able to avoid a lot of the problems that folks have been having with some of the Skyboxes. So that's it for me. Have a good one. Take care.